Welcome to the Deep Dive. Hey, especially to those of you tuning in from Mr. A's World History class, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're jumping into Unit 4, Imperialism. Specifically, Lesson 3, Imperialism in Africa. Think of this as your review session, really getting to the heart of the big questions from this part of history.
Exactly. And the main question we're tackling today, our sort of central historical question for this deep dive, is this. To what extent did European powers' stated goals of civilizing Africa align with the actual methods and impacts of their imperial rule?
Yeah, that's the core of it. So our mission here is to dig into the sources you've been looking at, speeches, political cartoons, those maps, historical accounts. We want to pull out the key facts, maybe some surprising details, and really connect the dots for you, our listener, to help make sense of that central question. Ready to unpack?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's kick things off by looking at the initial justifications, the motivations claimed by European powers, and the Congo. Yeah. Well, that's a really potent place to start, isn't it? We've got source A, that speech from 1877 by King Leopold II of Belgium. He talked about the Congo, and, well, he laid out some pretty lofty goals, at least on paper.
He really did.
He said he wanted to open to civilization the only part of our globe which it has yet to penetrate. Talked about piercing the darkness. He even called it, what was it, a crusade worthy of this century of progress.
A crusade, yeah. And importantly, he made a point of saying he had no selfish designs, absolutely none.
Sounds quite noble, right? But then
yeah, you immediately have to look at source B. It's this British magazine cartoon from 1906 in the rubber coils.
Right.
And the visual is just stark. It shows Belgium personified as this huge coiled snake.
Right, the snake.
And it's literally strangling a person from the Congo. The caption calls the snake unnecessary and unwelcome, and you can just see people being crushed, strangled by this new rule. It's incredibly graphic.
So what are we seeing here? We've got source A, Leopold's speech, full of these high-minded ideals, civilization, progress, no selfishness.
Lots of buzzwords.
Exactly. And then source B, the cartoon, showing this brutal, violent reality. How do these two pieces right next to each other help us answer that central question about stated goals versus reality?
Well, it immediately shatters the facade, doesn't it? It shows this massive gap between the rhetoric, the civilizing mission story, and the actual lived experience of exploitation and, frankly, terror for the Congolese under Leopold's rule.
So the civilizing talk wasn't just inaccurate, it was maybe a cover story.
You could definitely argue that. It served as a public justification, a way to make brutal economic exploitation seem somehow acceptable, even necessary back in Europe. It paints the civilizing narrative itself as a tool of imperialism.
Wow. Okay, so the Congo is one really powerful and horrifying example. But this wasn't just Leopold, right? This was part of a much bigger picture.
Absolutely. This leads us straight into the broader context, the so-called scramble for Africa.
That phrase itself, scramble. It sounds chaotic, a bit desperate even. What did that actually look like?
Well, it culminated in the Berlin Conference in 1884-85. The stated purpose was kind of ironic. It was supposedly to bring some order to this process, to discuss how European nations would divide up Africa and, crucially, access its natural resources.
Okay, so they met to discuss dividing up a continent. Who was actually there?
You had representatives from all the major European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, and the United States was there too, drawing lines on a map, essentially.
But here's the kicker, right? Who wasn't invited to this conference about Africa's future?
Yeah, not a single representative from any African nation or kingdom. Zero.
Think about that. Why? Why were they completely excluded? The source material points to a pretty clear and disturbing reason.
It does. It basically says that the European powers viewed African people as inferior. Their opinions, their desires, their existing political structures, none of it mattered. They were simply disregarded.
Which really underscores what scramble meant in practice.
Exactly. It wasn't negotiation. It was, like you said, a chaotic rush. First come, first serve. European nations were literally racing against each other to claim as much territory as possible, often with no real knowledge of the land or the people living there.
And if you look at the map that comes with the sources.
Oh, the map tells a huge story. You see immediately that France and Great Britain ended up with the lion's share, vast stretches of territory.
Huge areas.
And by the end of it all, only 2 countries in Africa remained independent, Ethiopia and Liberia, just 2. It also shows Spain got the least land among the European powers involved. It visually drives home the scale of this takeover.
So once they claimed these territories through speeches or conferences or just planting flags, how did they actually govern? How did they exert control? The sources mention two main methods, direct and indirect rule.
Right. Let's break those down. First, direct rule. This is pretty much what it sounds like. Foreign officials, administrators from the European country were brought in to run the colony directly. Local people had no say, no self-rule whatsoever.
And the goal there?
The ultimate goal was assimilation, to essentially make the local population adopt European culture, language, customs, government structures, schools, legal systems. Everything was based purely on the European model. Total imposition.
Okay, that's direct rule. What about the other one, indirect rule?
Indirect rule was a bit different, maybe more subtle on the surface, but still about control. In this system, they used local chiefs or existing rulers as intermediaries, so native government officials were technically in place.
Ah, so there was some self-rule.
Limited self-rule, very limited. The real power still rested with the European colonizers. The goal here wasn't necessarily full assimilation, but rather to develop a class of local leaders who would be loyal to the colonial power, kind of grooming collaborators, in a sense.
So the institutions might still be based on European models, but maybe allowed for some local customs to continue.
Exactly. They might incorporate some local rules, perhaps to make colonial administration run smoother or seem less alien, but fundamentally it was still European control, just exercised through local figures.
So, thinking back to that central question, whether it was direct or indirect rule, how do these methods stack up against those claims of civilizing? It sounds more like different strategies for domination, really.
That's certainly a critical perspective, isn't it? Neither method was truly about empowering the local population in a genuine way. They were administrative tools designed for efficient control and resource extraction, regardless of the civilizing rhetoric used to justify them. It makes you question the sincerity of those initial claims even more.
Okay, let's make this even more concrete. The sources give us specific examples. Let's look at Egypt and the Suez Canal first. Massive engineering project. What was the story there?
The Suez Canal is fascinating. Its main purpose was pretty straightforward: economics and geopolitics. It was designed to dramatically shorten the sea route between Europe and Asia.
Cut out that long trip around the tip of Africa, right?
Precisely. Saved thousands of miles and weeks of travel time. Hugely important for trade and military movement. Now, a French diplomat initially got the concession, the agreement, from Egypt's rulers.
And the construction itself?
Took about 10 years, and this is crucial. It was largely built by Egyptian peasants, many of whom were forced laborers, essentially prisoners. They worked under incredibly harsh conditions in the intense desert heat.
Forced labor. Again, that doesn't exactly scream civilizing mission, does it?
Not at all. It highlights the human cost behind these grand imperial projects. So much suffering went into building something primarily for European benefit.
And who owned it? That changed, didn't it?
It did. Initially, Egypt held the majority ownership through shares, but Egypt faced serious financial difficulties, partly due to the canal's cost and other factors, and ended up selling its shares to Great Britain.
So Britain gained a huge strategic and financial stake.
A massive one. The canal was intended for international use. Much later, control did shift back to Egypt under Nasser, which, as the source notes, led to the Suez Crisis in 1956, a major international conflict involving Britain, France, Israel, and Egypt. Shows just how vital that waterway was.
Okay, Egypt and the Suez Canal show the economic and strategic drivers, and the human cost. Let's shift south now, to South Africa and the Zulu Wars. What does this example tell us?
The Zulu Wars really highlight the element of resistance and the violence inherent in imperial expansion. We have the British, led by Lieutenant General Frederick Augustus, deciding to invade Zululand. Now, the context there is complex, involving the Boers, those descendants of Dutch settlers who had their own history and conflicts in the region.
Right, the Boers were also expanding.
Yes. But the key figure here is Cetshwayo, the Zulu king. He was determined to maintain Zulu independence and resist European encroachment.
And did they resist?
Fiercely. In the initial major battle at Isandlwana, the British suffered a devastating defeat, a huge shock to the empire. It showed the strength and organization of the Zulu army.
So it wasn't an easy conquest.
Far from it. But despite that early victory and fierce resistance, the British regrouped, brought in more forces, and eventually overwhelmed the Zulus. Zululand was ultimately defeated, annexed, and later incorporated into the Union of South Africa in 1910.
So another case where civilizing seems like a pretty thin veil over military conquest and the suppression of independence.
Absolutely. It demonstrates that when faced with determined resistance, the methods employed were often outright warfare and subjugation. directly contradicting any notion of a peaceful or benevolent civilizing process.
Okay, let's pull all of this together then. We've looked at Leopold's rhetoric versus the reality in the Congo, the scramble for Africa, and the Berlin Conference excluding Africans, direct versus indirect rule, the Suez Canal's forced labor, and the violent Zulu Wars. Coming back to our central historical question, to what extent did the stated civilizing goals match the actual methods and impacts? What's the big takeaway?
I think the sources consistently point to a major disconnect, a profound gap. You have these European powers frequently talking a good game, civilization, progress, ending darkness, Christianizing, you name it. Leopold is just one example.
The public-facing justification.
Exactly, but the actual methods. They consistently involve force, coercion, economic exploitation, and political domination. We saw forced labor in the Congo and Egypt. We saw the entire continent carved up without consent at Berlin. We saw political control imposed through direct or indirect rule, neither focused on genuine self-determination. And we saw outright warfare used to crush resistance, like with the Zulus.
So the civilizing narrative often seems more like a rationalization after the fact, or maybe a PR campaign, rather than the genuine driving force.
That's a very strong interpretation supported by the evidence here. The rhetoric of progress served to mask or legitimize actions driven primarily by economic greed, strategic advantage, national rivalries, and, underpinning it all, a deeply ingrained belief in European racial and cultural superiority. The impact, far from purely civilizing, was often devastating for African societies.
It really forces you, the listener, to critically examine those stated intentions anytime you encounter them in history, doesn't it? To always ask, what were the actions? What were the results on the ground?
Precisely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something to ponder after this deep dive. How do the echoes of this era, these patterns of resource extraction, imposed borders, power imbalances, and the very language of development or civilization, how do they continue to shape global relationships and inequalities today? And what does it truly mean to civilize or develop another society, especially when it involves force or ignores the agency of the people themselves? It's a heavy question, but one worth wrestling with.
Definitely something to think about. History isn't just about the past, it shapes our present. We hope this deep dive has helped you connect those dots for your review and given you plenty to consider. Thanks for joining us.